Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their diverse stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Peter Jung joins us to discuss facilitating D&D social skills groups, silos in the autism community, and routines in socially demanding situations. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Peter, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
My pleasure.
I'd love to start off by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
So 4 points that are like the big kind of, the light bulb going on a little bit, or this is a significant point. So it really started in third grade, where I actually had an ADHD diagnosis. I wasn't hyper, I wasn't impulsive, but in a really busy, crowded, noisy classroom, I couldn't focus, which was definitely ADHD. But they found that I was really good with some of the kids in the special education classroom. When they were having meltdowns, they found that I was really good at, just walking up to them and understanding them and playing Star Wars figurines with them. So they would actually pull me out of class in third grade to go and play Star Wars figurines with kids that were having meltdowns, and I would get them calmed down. So I kind of like to joke that I've been doing autistic crisis de-escalation since I was 8, and I know those Star Wars figurines they're just amazing. Really, that kind of made me have a deep understanding growing up that like these kids that are in crisis and going through stuff, usually they just need someone gentle who speaks their language and can just treat them like a human in a world where they're being, treated like a monster or a problem or a leper. Someone who just wants to sit down and play Star Wars figurines with them. That goes a long way. And that would actually kind of influence a lot of the D&D work I would do. So that was kind of the first aha moment. In seventh grade, I tried masking in middle school. Elementary school, I just stayed inside all the time and just read Goosebumps books nonstop and UFO books. But in sixth and seventh grade, I felt I needed to make some friends. And so I went in masking, and it was awful. I tried football. That was worse. And finally, near the end of seventh grade and eighth grade, this kid sits down next to me in detention and starts talking about the God Emperor of Mankind and Warhammer 40K and all this stuff. I'm like, this is really interesting. And then he made his own version of Dungeons and Dragons called Monsters and Mazes. I assume he had never seen that movie called Monsters and Mazes starring Tom Hanks. If you haven't watched it, don't. It's bad. But it was his bare bones version of D&D. And then about a year later, we were playing D&D. It was great. And they're all autistic. And so suddenly I have autistic friends where I can learn how to be an autistic friend, not a masking neurotypical friend. And a big part of that friendship was just me playing the cleric, which is the healer, and being popular because I'm the guy with all the healing spells, so everyone wants to be my friend. So that gave me a really good framework to actually learn how to make friends in an autistic way. After college, I got a job working in crisis, and it was crisis and foster care and intensive services. So these were usually CPS referred cases. Many of them were autistic. And I kind of became, they called me the angry autistic boy whisperer. So angry autistic boys between 8 and 12, I could just get them and communicate really well with them. And oftentimes I'd hear really heartbreaking things like, you're the only person who really tries to understand me, or you're asking questions that no one has ever asked me about what my life is like. I'm like, it's because I know where you're going through. I've been there too. So I was really, really effective there. And then a buddy of mine who diagnoses autism for a living said, Peter, you should get assessed. And lo and behold, I'm autistic. Where I kind of started really hitting the community piece was about 11 years ago. I made friends with an autistic psychologist named Dr. Rafael Bocamazzo, and he was running these D&D social skills groups, and we hit it off really well, and he hired me on to go run those groups. I've now been running that same D&D group for like 11 years. And that has really propelled me into the autism community because suddenly I started talking about, hey, maybe we should rethink how we teach social skills to autistic people. I've gotten a lot of really, really positive feedback from autistic people and a lot of kind of not so great feedback from non-autistic people who think they're doing a good job. Now I am working, doing a lot of work with disability nonprofits. I actually have had multiple jobs, like 5 different jobs in the past 3 or 4 years. Kind of what I'm really trying to do is learn everything I can from the inside of the autism world. So I did a stint at an ABA clinic, which was really interesting. I am currently working for a parent training organization. I work for a disability nonprofit. I worked for an autism video game company. I've done a bunch of D&D social skill stuff. And really kind of the big bottom line that makes me welcome anywhere is I just say, hey, I can do D&D groups. And they usually say, cool, we want you.
When I read that you have a therapeutic dungeon master certification, I knew I really wanted to talk with you, Peter. So, which makes me wonder, thinking about that, how tabletop role-playing games have been therapeutic in your life.
That's really interesting because a lot of people want to talk about how the act of role-playing helps them therapeutically. And for that, yes, it has, but I think the real benefit for me has been what's been happening at the table. And I think that's more meaningful. So, for example, like 10 years ago, I was kind of struggling with some body image stuff. And I decided, you know what, I want to start going to the gym. I want to get swole. I want to start, actually, getting in shape. So I started playing this really beefy half-orc barbarian who was just like super muscular, almost Hulk Hogan-esque, and very over the top, and kind of playing this brawny, muscled out, badass kind of helped me feel more comfortable, like going to the gym, being more comfortable with my body. So there's things like that. But I think the more meaningful things are what's happening at the table outside the game, where I suddenly feel like I have friends. When I first started, I didn't have friends. And now playing D&D, I'm getting invited to people's houses to play D&D. I have friends. And that was therapeutic. And that actually turned into a safety net in my 20s. Because I'm still friends with that group. And that created a lot of social capital for me when I was a absolute disaster in my early 20s. To be honest, I think a lot of people in their early 20s are absolute disasters, but I was particularly disastrous. And having this group of people that I played D&D with every week gave me a sense of community. And if things were going south for me, they could kind of step in. And so sometimes it's just like, hey, yeah, you're short on rent. Here's $50. Or let's go to a bar. Let's just relax and you can get stuff off your chest. And I would do the same for them. That side effect of having a sense of community ended up being a much more therapeutic aspect. But on the therapeutic side, it's interesting because I do not do therapy with my social skills groups. I have done D&D therapy where I paired with a therapist. I ran the game and they were a character in the game. But these groups I cannot call therapy, but I think they are immensely helpful in building a sense of community and building a sense of inclusion and modeling and normalizing autism, what it is to be openly autistic. I think a lot of autistics have had a lot of neurotypical therapy and they haven't had a lot of autistic community. And I think finding your own people and realizing that, hey, other people feel like this, other people have been through this, they have their own stories, they have their own advice about what to do about it, and they can help advocate. That's huge. That's therapeutic, and they're not going to get that in, a lot of traditional therapeutic sessions where people are not understanding their perspective. So really what I have kind of moved forward on is looking at it from a community building angle. And then the reason I'm a therapeutic game master is I run the website rollforkindness.com, where I just talk about a lot of these things. And the guys at Geek Therapeutics are like, do you want our certification for free? I'm like, yes. So they gave it to me for free, and I wrote them a glowing review because it was actually very good.
I'm wondering about facilitation of these groups and accessibility. For those that might be interested in running tabletop role-playing groups that are accessible to autistic people, what would be your suggestions for them? Because I'm wondering about many times maybe these groups not being as accessible.
So that's a really interesting question. I think you have to ask, what is the goal of the group? What's your end goal? So if this is like a social skills group, I think you really need to focus on just basic autistic socialization and representation on that front. So that means, hiring autistics to run the groups. If this is just a group for fun, just talk to the person, find out what they need, build a relationship with that person where they feel like they can be comfortable being part of that group. If this is like a teacher running a D&D game where they're also teaching physics and having like this whole trebuchet mechanic where the kids have to do like parabola things to make sure that their trebuchets are correctly hitting the castle or whatever. Yeah, I think you would need to think about, okay, is there like maybe some learning disabilities going on? What other accessibility needs are you looking at? So I think you need a really just robust understanding of social accessibility around the game, making sure that the people you're playing with feel empowered to self-advocate. And that's actually one of the things that I've done a lot with my groups, because I kind of think that there is this sort of pyramid of social skills that are taught. There is, the basic bottom of the pyramid, which is your generic kind of masking skills, and that's kind of what everyone gets. These are the skills that you are expected to have to do customer service, to do fine at a wedding or a funeral, or do a shift at McDonald's. These are these basic kind of fundamental skills, which for autistics are usually masking. They're usually very, very exhausting. And I think for a lot of people, they're exhausting. So there's some intersectionality there. If you've got, people who do not feel comfortable in a very white, neurotypical centric, straight centric space, they're going to feel like they're putting on a mask all the time. So there's some interesting intersectional pieces there. But ultimately, I do feel like these skills are somewhat important to learn, because they can help you keep a job and help you exist in a world that's not designed for you and be able to survive. I don't like that. It is that way, but it is that way. But because they're important doesn't mean they're the whole equation. I think the next part of it is the autistic social skills. These are what you see when you go to like a gaming convention and look around at the tabletop gaming thing. You see all these people playing Magic the Gathering, and they're getting along in very autistic ways. They're having super esoteric rules arguments and geeking out together and not making any eye contact, and it's beautiful. They are comfortable unmasking around each other because they're focused on this game, and that's a very safe place for that to happen. At the top of the pyramid, and not a lot of people think about this, and this is something that I really try to teach, is the idea of autistic social advocacy. Now, this isn't just normal advocacy. This is a framework that I designed, and I'm actually getting it published in October in a peer-reviewed journal, where it's a series of skills that autistic youth and adults need to develop to support each other in an advocacy-centered way, where they're able to, self and peer advocate and resolve conflicts in a way that comes from a place of autism, not a place of what we're doing is wrong, it needs to be pathologized. Comes from a really equitable place, and learning how to have conversations about inequity, and then also really aggressively normalizing and learning to love your autism. And I'll be the first to say that having an autistic brain, you sometimes hate it, but the things that are kind of difficult need the most love, especially when they're in a world that hates them. So learning how to love your own autistic brain, love everyone else's autistic brain, and find joy in that as a kind of real tactical move to say, F you to the systems that would say you're a broken person. So those skills are all kind of social advocacy pieces that I think if you're looking at doing a social skills group, you should be thinking about. But if you're running, just kind of a stereotypical D&D group and you've got an autistic person there, I think just learning how they work, what sort of gameplay they like, maybe questions about, what's their stamina level? Do they prefer the more tactical stuff, or do they like the heavy role playing? If there's big role playing scenes, are they cool just kind of sitting back and watching things? And maybe safety tools. The ability to say, hey, this makes me uncomfortable. We need to take a break. And so learning how to do that, and also just how to, normalize their existence at the table. But at the same time, I think D&D is a very autistic hobby. There's a lot of I always like to say, if you shake a D&D tree, a bunch of autistics fall out. And so I think the game is already pretty autistic leaning for many autistics.
You recently gave a presentation at the annual American Psychological Conference on empowering autistic group leaders, how autistic facilitation unlocks opportunities for building autistic community. I love this, and I was really curious, this being like such a mainstream conference, what the feedback you received or the questions you were asked that might have particularly resonated with you.
Wasn't. What happened is the thing that always ends up happening at these conferences. People just want to talk about D&D. So it turned into just me talking about D&D and doing that. But I spent a lot of time on the expo hall floor just talking with people. And the feedback I got there was really interesting. A lot of people were just kind of blown away by the level of insight I had as an autistic person who had worked in the field and been very open about his autism. And I think that was frustrating because I felt like, yes, I have some really good insights, but it's kind of one of those things where in these spaces, there have been so many events pertaining to autism and pertaining to autistic care where I'm the only autistic person in the room. And there's been cases where it's like been 500 people at an autism event, and I'm the single autistic person in the room. And it's like, what is going on here? And so I think more than anything, I just noticed that there was this lack of autistic voices in this space. And yet there were a lot of autism providers there and a lot of people doing autism work and doing research on autism, and not including autistic voices. And I think it wasn't any interesting questions. It was more wow, that's just amazing. I'd never thought of it like that way, things that way. And it's like, that's really sad because I'm not reinventing the wheel here. So something that I was really hoping to do with this presentation was argue for the inclusion of hiring more autistics in the group therapy space as a means of helping autistics in group therapy. Because I had this one girl that I was working with some time ago, and she had been to group therapy, and she said she would always come up with the most ridiculous traumas to share during group therapy, like her uncle dying in a freak fishing accident where he got chopped up by a boat motor or something ridiculous like that. And she saw the whole thing and there's blood everywhere. And of course it made up because she didn't want to share with the group that she froze up at a Subway and didn't know what to order. And that was what was actually traumatic to her, because people wouldn't understand. There's no one who could actually get that. So realizing that if you're having, a group therapy where there's going to be a lot of neurodivergent people who have those really unconventional kind of pathways to trauma and pathways to, a different experience of the world, you need to be including people with those diagnoses. And so this is something I say a lot, is like, you wouldn't want to go to an OBGYN clinic where there's no woman working there. Although someone recently pointed out that, 50 years ago, though, that was the case. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. But still, what I love about, he when he pointed that out, he showed that things do change. It's things aren't that way anymore. And, hopefully with this push that's happening specifically in Washington about nothing about us without us, there's a bill that just passed called Nothing About Us Without Us that says if there's a task force or a committee pertaining to a specific population, you need to have representation in that task force. Hopefully, medical providers will start looking at this and realize, and we're offering autism services, we damn well better be hiring at least some autistics who are willing to be the autistic in the room. Not people who are gonna hire them and then put them on the spot, but put them in a place where it's clear that they have the ability to call things out and to have their voices matter and not be talked over. But unfortunately, a lot of the autism services industry is kind of antithetical to that, I think. There's just a lot of really nasty strife, and it's unfortunate.
I can definitely relate to Subway, or as I like to call it, the trauma of Subway, or the trauma of a Chipotle, or that style. Because no matter, even if I know when I walk in there and rehearse in my mind what I'm going to get, every time when they ask me that question, and I'm expected to process this with a new person right then and there, I always kind of like freeze up and panic. And I don't know, most of the time I come out with what I want, but not all the time.
But for me, I'm big on routines, so I can do great if my routine is there. But if I'm at Subway and they don't have the meatballs, I'll just walk out. Oh, it's just like, no, I cannot do this. My routine will not work.
I would not know what to do if the meatballs were not there.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier, but you're the author of the blog Roll for Kindness, and your most recent post referred to the show Silos, which I'm a big fan of. It's on Apple TV. Season 2 is coming out in the next couple of months. So people, I would recommend seeing season 1 if you like dystopia. Now, you mentioned in your blog post about this show to bring up an important point of silos in the autism community, in which you stated were us as autistic people, parents, and medical providers. Now, I know this is a really big question, but what do you think might be some ways the three of these groups can learn from each other to better work together? Because we all need each other.
The best way I've seen is to have people that exist in both silos or vaults. Okay. Let's go over to Fallout. Which back to back, while I watched Silo and then I watched Fallout, and that was just so much fun. Very different shows. One's very existential, then one's just some of the best satire. But going back to this idea of silos, pretty much I've been really thinking about it a lot over the course of my career because I'm a self-advocate. I hang out in a lot of self-advocacy spaces. And I'm friends with a lot of self-advocates, and I do very well there. And I have some very, very close friends, and we've done some wonderful work together. I also have 8 years working in intensive services. These are the crisis cases. These are the situations where you got really dangerous to self and others behaviors. You've got kids who are coming home and punching holes in the wall, punching mom, beating up the 2-year-old sister. Really, really intense situations where there's this hey, we need these systems to really kind of shut this behavior down. And then I'll go into schools, which I put into the medical thing, where they are just trying to get kids to, sit down and shut up and fit into a mold, which I get from a teacher perspective because I've also taught. And I had some neurodivergent kids that were making me tear my hair out because they were just so disruptive. And I'm trying to handle 38th graders who are already bouncing off the walls and dealing with all the hormones and surliness and everything else. And, I get it. But at the same time, I also remember that I'm one of those kids. I remember having those challenges. So all that annoyance and anger and thoughts that we have to do things these ways just to maintain control, those are tempered because I've walked in those shoes. I've been there. I know what it's like. And it allows me to have a really nuanced understanding. So I started really kind of having two versions of myself that were sort of integrating, the Peter as a care coordinator. So I was like a case manager for all these cases, but I was really heavily involved with them. I was in these homes, multiple times a week doing assessments and whatnot. So I got to see the crises as they're happening. And I was seeing myself in them, while also taking notes, doing paperwork, doing de-escalation, seeing everything. And so that gave me this really interesting view of the inside of both organizations. And then I was working for a disability nonprofit called the Arc of King County, where they had parent-to-parent groups, which were like these parent support groups for kids with autism. And I would go and sit in on those and see the parent perspective. And, thankfully this group was good, but I started looking at other parent groups that were not good. They were very, I call it the trauma narrative versus the tragedy narrative. A trauma narrative is okay. A trauma narrative is fine. Say you're a parent of an autistic child, and that child has some really high behavioral needs, and it's hard. You're going through it, and it's stressful, and there's aggression. Your trauma is valid, and it is okay to say that. Learning how to deal with trauma in a way where you can grow from it is the beauty of a trauma narrative, because it says, these are my wounds. Here's how I'm going to work towards healing and making a better life for me, my family, my child, and us to move forward. Here's the reality of where we are. And we're going to learn how to, make lemonades with lemon. And that's great. The problem is a lot of parents and parent groups fall into the tragedy narrative. And a tragedy narrative just builds pity. It builds some lot of really just toxic stuff. And, the cool thing about sitting in all those groups, and I'm not a parent, but I'd like it to be at some point. But the beauty of sitting on these groups, I could point out my perspective when kids would be talking about, oh, my autistic son is doing this and this and this. I'd be like, I remember doing that. And here's what that meant. And what was helpful about that was it gave them hope. But I always like to say, there's no hope without the homework. So I'd say like, hey, I turned out okay, but it's rough. You got to work on these skills. You got to work on developing these things, and it's going to be hard. But the payoff is, you have these skills, and it requires a lot of patience, a lot of work, a lot of time. So you can have hope. I'm here to give you hope, but also tell you hope is work. And I think that was a really good mitigator from the tragedy narrative, because the tragedy narrative says that things will never get better. My autistic son is going to ruin my life. He's going to ruin my marriage. I can't have friends over anymore. All these bad things that I hear from parents who buy into the tragedy narrative. Whereas the parents that acknowledge that there's trauma there and look for solutions, they learn to laugh at it. And that is the most powerful thing, when they could just be like, Joey's just been weird again. So, yep, I guess we're not doing Applebee's tonight. We're just doing McDonald's. Our whole family is kind of crazy. Let's just laugh at it. Laugh at everything and just the absurdity, and find the weird silver linings so you don't constantly get bogged down. And a lot of the most successful parents of real high behavioral need autistics, I've met, are really, really good at finding the humor, because they can just see how absurd their life is, and they can laugh at it. And when you're laughing at something, you're taking the power away from, the message of the world that says that you're a failure. your family is a failure, your child is broken. No, you're laughing at just how stupid and silly everything is, and you take power away from that evil, because fundamentally those mentalities are evil and they fuel a lot of really toxic, medical approaches and things that are done to autistics that are hideous. Learning how to empower parents to have hope, to laugh, to see the joy, and realize my life is weird and strange and bizarre. I didn't expect it to go this way, but here we are and we're going to roll with it. That is really, really important. I think that is the benefit of having someone from another silo coming in and saying like, hey, I'm from the autism silo. It's crazy over there, but it's fun. I'll always leave aside the term crazy. I'm one of those people that grew up connecting with all the crazy characters on TV. All the mad scientists. So I kind of reclaim it. But in any case, I know it's a bit of a hot word, phrase, whatever. But yeah.
And lastly, Peter, how can our listeners learn about you beyond this interview?
I am on Twitter or X as Roll for Kindness. That's ROLLFORKINDNESS. I am also on LinkedIn as Peter Jung. That's JUNG. There's a bunch of Peter Jungs on LinkedIn, I think. But I'm the one with a black sweater with a D&D die in my hand, I think. I also run rollforkindness.com, and that's ROLLFORKINDNESS.com.
Well, Peter, I really love getting to spend this time with you today. Thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Peter for the conversation. To learn more about Peter and his blog, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on what routines do you use to manage socially demanding situations for you, like a Subway or Chipotle. Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to lead self-directed, purpose-driven lives through our customized life coaching and community groups. Our distinct approach prioritizes each client's unique goals and preferences, fostering a sense of agency and promoting self-advocacy. Our coaches work collaboratively with clients to develop personalized strategies and tools that can help with executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationship building, stress management, and much more. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. With our accessible remote services, individuals from any location can receive the assistance and mentoring they need. So please join us today to experience judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.